Hey everybody, let's have a quick chat about Get Buff One, the book, which was released initially in 1999. First in a purplish kind of cover, but then very soon after that, the colours that you see behind me. I'm not sure if anybody did. Anyone ever get the purple version, or time had passed and you got the yellow and blue version behind me?
Never the pearl.
Which one, Dave? Also the purple one? Yeah. I
No,
did an
never the
interview
pearl.
with a KSI, long-term KSI supporter who very proudly showed me, and I'd hand I'd hand numbered the inside cover of that release, and I think he got number 12, for example. He was very proud of it, and so he should be. It was beautiful to see someone so proudly holding up a numbered and signed copy of a book released in 1999, literally. So I'm assuming we've all got the blue and yellow version, which has been around for a long time. That was pretty quick to come in. But for me, Get Buff One was pretty significant. Now, the challenge was, I don't know if any of you were around in the time. When I say around at the time, I'm talking about if you got Get Buff One in 1999, you would know what I'm talking about. It had contained things in it that nobody had seen before, generally speaking. There are a few people who were reading T-Mag, the online magazine at the time, um, and they would have been exposed to that material a little bit, but generally speaking, it was totally new to the entire world. And I know that for a lot of people, they don't understand how fast the world changes, but that was the situation back in 99. Does anyone have any recollection of how disruptive that content was?
Yeah, I do remember that. Well, there was some content, for example, that there were not many sets. When I bought the book, when I read the book first, I was already doing some strength training for many years, actually. I never did a program with only like 12 sets in total. That for me was the most disruptive thing. But
Yeah.
the most interesting thing was that the results of doing that program, I never had those amazing results before.
What do you think that was, though? Was it the low volume only, or was it the way? Because there was a lot more to the program design, and I'll talk about the unique program design. Was it the way the program was laid out over the four stages, or was it the low volume, or was it both?
It was most of all the low volume, and that in combination with rest weeks, which was also a new concept for me.
There was zero discussion about the concept of recovery in the bodybuilding world at that point in time. So I brought my knowledge from the sport, which was far more advanced at that time than the bodybuilding community, and the concept of recovery and including recovery weeks was pretty unique, pretty new. There are a lot of other things though that just weren't out there. I want to go back to the unique bodyweight exercises. In that decade, 1990s, it was the first decade where strength training was being accepted by the masses, and the strength community were really celebrating that reality. So it was the 90s was about how much you can lift, and mainly in the compound movements. It was mainly Olympic lifting, powerlifting kind of decade. Now, that comes and goes, obviously, but there was almost zero bodyweight exercises in Western world bodybuilding. Now, obviously, if you go back through the more Eastern European literature, you might find some more bodyweight exercise books back in the 70s, etc. But there was no bodyweight exercises in strength training. So this whole functional training thing that kicked off when they worked out how to package my material and sell some overpriced pool noodles with it. Um, that gave everybody a greater awareness of the possibilities of bodyweight exercises. But in 1999, bodyweight exercises were like a slap in the face. In fact, I can remember the editor of T-Mag back in the day having to encourage the readers to, give it a go. Like, I understand you can be cynical, but give it a go. It was really encouraging to give it a go. So I think, Dave, you had obviously, by the time you got exposed to it, maybe bodyweight exercise is integrated into strength training. In the Western world, it already been more apparent, as I said, due to the popularization of functional training. And I can assure you, the authors of the functional training material, they weren't doing bodyweight exercises when they first saw my material. And I won't go too deep on that, but um,
Well,
does
now that you
anybody
mentioned that,
remember
sorry,
the? Yeah, go, Dave.
Now that you mentioned that, when I was doing those little body weight exercises in the gym, everyone was looking like I'm a weirdo. Um,
Yes.
no one was doing that. You're spot on. And then,
Yeah.
before I forget, doing those small muscle groups before big muscle groups, that was heretical. That
Mm.
was everyone said you can't do that. Impossible. You
Mm.
can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
It was
The
interesting.
pre-fatigue sequence, like I didn't create the pre-fatigue sequence, but I popularized it, and I showed people how to integrate it into the longer multi-stage program of strength training, because you don't do it forever, but it's very powerful if you do it in the early phase of a longer program. So now it's coming back to you, Dave. Some of the very disruptive things, like Get Buff One, I believe was the most disruptive strength book that's been published in the last half a century, without a doubt. Because very little of it was accepted or in place, like the squat, the deadlift, the Olympic lifts. Yeah, sure, they were there. Didn't apart from my pelvic control model, that's another story. But those are accepted. But the bodyweight exercises, they weren't accepted. They weren't being used. They weren't being integrated into strength training. Bodyweight exercise was seen as something you did with a kid, or maybe you did in an environment where you had no equipment. It wasn't something you did by choice in a gym full of equipment. And in fact, the equipment manufacturers struggle with it because you can't sell any equipment. If someone's already got their body weight, how can you only have to get some guru who'd be willing to be paid off to tell that they have to hold something in their hand, yeah, or stand on something and hold something in their hand. Otherwise, equipment manufacturers miss out. But now David's starting to come back to you because those body weight exercises were left field, absolutely left field, and that's not even including the fact that some of them have never been seen before, like the single leg stiff-legged deadlift and the bent knee single leg deadlift were exercises that were just, well, I introduced them, I innovated them, and they were never seen before. Now, obviously, they've been bastardized so badly now into so many different permutations, but that's a different story. Um, so they were some of the disruptive elements. Does anyone else remember anything disruptive about the Get Buff program in the day? I mean, you didn't get it in '99, but by the time you got it, was anything still a bit disruptive?
Yeah, so I was doing it.
Go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, so I was doing it in about 2010 when I entered, and it was still the era of do as many sets, and the exercises got to be bang for buck. So there's no way that you should be doing anything else other than compound movements. But what really differentiated it was there was the sequence of exercises and talking about balance. So we work about um, getting like the pulling movements, horizontal pulls and vertical pulls in first, and the hip dominant movements. So there was just no structure at that era that when I was training. I mean, not there is too much of it now, but yeah. So it was really
Oh,
ahead of its time.
yeah, absolutely, because the words hip dominant, horizontal pull push, vertical pull push, the concept of pushing and pulling were there, but the classification of vertical and horizontal wasn't necessarily, and the hip and quad dominant classifications just didn't exist. So those six major lines of movement were part of my model that I released during. I started developing in the '80s, released it in the '90s, and that Get Buff book was the first time the bodybuilding community got to expose to the lines of movement concept, which I'd already published in How to Write book in '98 and been teaching it in prior seminars and publications, but that was the first time the bodybuilding community got exposed to the concept of hip and quad being two different muscles. Because, with all due respect to Bill Pearl, and I've got a lot of respect for Bill, I really appreciate him as a person and his contribution. When he published his very significant book, The Keys in a Universe, he talked about the legs. It was just the legs, where I broke the lower body into two, hip dominant, quad dominant. So no, that was definitely foreign. See, that's another example of what was foreign back then. And even though more people have been exposed to the bastardized version of my lines of movement concept by the simple changing of one word, and that as if that makes it different, people might think they know about it, but I don't see the application of it to any great extent. That's the story itself. Because what I'm saying is, when I walk around, I see some really big buff quads and not a shitload of posterior chain muscles on most people. And they even can verbalize the concept, but they aren't demonstrating it. So the words are speaking, their actions are speaking louder than their words in that regard. So that was a good point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Were there any other disruptive things, Vic, or we go to Don?
Yeah, just one more thing. I distinctively remembered that back in the day, it was really just lifting as much as you can, and there's no progression. And I remember there was this particular program that I was doing, and I wish
Uh-huh.
I didn't do it. It was a German volume training. And imagine a guy doing that, 10 sets of 10 without and I was a young guy. Of course, young guy, you gotta lift everything heavy. And I'm sure that contributed to some of the hip damage that I've got. But I just didn't understand progression. And
Mm.
so and get buff, if you read the book, the whole thing is like the progression, everything has meaning behind it. So yeah, that's the thing I'll
Yeah,
raise.
absolutely. So in Get Buffed, I produce models of progression. I don't think anybody had seen them before, generally speaking. I mean, if you're involved in high level weightlifting and high level powerlifting, you might have had exposed to those sort of models, but the general population had no exposure to progression and models. And I gave very clear models. In fact, they were so simple and impactful that I found them published in multiple different books of people who had bought my book and then turned around and republished it as their own. But the 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 absence of progression in training in programming in the application of a program is just like you're basically killing yourself in terms of you're killing the success of the program if you just go and lift as heavy as you can from week one on. There's a reason behind the progression models that I shared, and I think the education in Get Buff One and subsequent books is critical to optimize your training effects, including the use of progression. And it's not just the word, because everyone knows progressive resistance overload. That's the key behind how strength training works. But nobody was getting exposed to simple yet effective models of progression that were contained in Get Buff One and Get Buff 2 and were applied in something one. So that's a really good point. Don, you had something to add?
Yes, following on the pre-fatigue, a good example of that was when we got to the power lift at the end of the program. I was knackered by then, and you just got so much value from just doing a slow speed, almost no weight power lift, and got amazing value from it, and a lot safer on the joints.
Yeah, so that's what I teach in the integration of the lifts, where you're not just going to reintroduce them later. We're not taking away from the lift. We're still going to maintain, we're going to stay in touch with them. But the beauty about it is you were too tired to lift it heavy anyway. So it was a real safety net. And you really had to work hard to control the bar because you have the muscle fatigue. So the chances of you focusing on your tech week were far higher. I found it incredibly effective. Basically, I would take the load off people, and yet if I develop them, if they I would develop their intermuscular coordination, their technical coordination, when loading was returned, they were technically more superior and able to lift more load as well as get a better selective recruitment. So the whole concept of selective recruitment just didn't exist in literature, generally speaking. So good point there that keeping a constant exposure to the main lifts, the big lifts, the compound lifts, is really important rather than just throwing them out for one or two phases. But they were de-emphasized. They put it at the back of the program. The load was minimal, the speed was slow, and you really worked on your technique. So anybody who did that really, I believe, gets a great result in the. When I say medium term, 12 weeks later, or 8 to 12 weeks later, 12 to 16 weeks later. Fantastic point. Tom, anything disruptive
Yeah.
you found to get back on?
Well, he was talking about speed of movement. I mean, that's a variable that I've never really thought about before I
Absolutely.
started doing these programs. I didn't read it in the late 90s, but when I did, all those bodyweight exercises were popularized. And then, so it was really impactful to learn how to actually do them properly and notice the big difference. But yeah, speed of movement and then, using speed of movement in different ways was huge.
I'm glad you said because I may be biased, but I believe that if you do my unique exercises in a manner as taught by others or modeled by others, you're not going to get the result that I had in mind. So I think it makes a huge difference. And I've had athletes come out of America and show me their single stiff-legged deadlifts, et cetera, and they've had a different training effect when I showed them how I intended it to do. So very very important point to follow the technical model. As far as speed of movement goes, you know, apart from a word, lift slowly, lower slowly, there was nothing there. Um, I think there was some weightlifting influences that Polycon had picked up on that had talked about controlling the eccentric speed in some instances, but generally speaking, nobody was out there manipulating the speed and all using my three-digit timing method, which I introduced to say, this is how many seconds I want you to take to complete the eccentric phase. This is how many seconds I want you to take to hold the pause, and then this is how many seconds I want you to take to complete the lift. So the whole concept of manipulating the variable of the pause alone. And I came up with that concept in the 1980s. They had some research support by an Australian biomechanist by the name of Greg Wilson in the mid-90s. But for a decade there, it was unsupported by science. I was introducing manipulation of the pause before anybody else had any concept about it. And it was pretty simple. I mean, in hindsight, everyone will say, well, that's pretty bloody obvious. And the longer you hold the bar at the bottom, et cetera, et cetera. But I dug deep into the stretch shortening cycle to fully understand it. And if you want to understand what I taught, there was a 3-part article series written in a Canadian Sports Journal about the stretch shortening cycle. But my study of the stretch shortening cycle was very important for me to understand how and why to manipulate the speed of the eccentric, the speed of the duration of the pause, and the speed of the concentric. The other thing that happened when people got exposed to it, then they started overdoing the concentric slowness, which for a bodybuilder is not a problem, but for an explosive sport athlete, you don't want to spend too much time going slow in the concentric phase. It's okay to do it a bit, but not exclusively or not predominantly. So that's something I had to really clarify because there were people teaching that concept that resulted in a misinterpretation. So some of the misinterpretations that occurred. No, you don't need a metronome. It's not an exact science. And secondly, don't spend too much time going slow in the concentric unless you are purely a bodybuilder. If hypertrophy is your sole and only interest, fantastic. The other thing that took people by surprise with the speed of movement is understanding the impact of the pause top and bottom, and that's a separate story in itself. But yes, Tom, the introduction of controlling the three aspects of the lift, the eccentric, the concentric, and the pause, was totally disruptive. When I started talking about it in the 90s, and definitely the bodybuilding community when it came out in the Get Buff book in 1999. So I think there were some other things. The program frequency back in that era was the popular program frequency was 5 days a week for bodybuilding, and it was usually on a rolling, 3 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off, 3 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off. It was just rolling. It was pretty intense. I certainly didn't come up with a concept of 4 days a week, but I popularized a return to the 4 days a week concept. But what I did, because of the lines of movement, I balanced out the exercise selection. So if you look at my exercise selection, I was pairing push-pulls and quad and separating quad and hip. So for example, you weren't squatting twice a week, you weren't deadlifting twice a week, you're doing one of each. And typically in the early stage, I'll come back to that actually, but you can really tell my program design because it was totally original in that the push-pulls were paired, vertical and horizontal, and the quad was once a week and hip was once a week. So I was bench pressing once a week, shoulder pressing once a week, horizontal rowing once a week, vertical pulling and pushing once a week. It was all once a week, which was completely different. A 4-day model. In fact, when I wrote for Men's Health in the Book of Muscle, they wanted a 3-day program. They wanted to because they wanted to be come up with something unique. Because all my Get Buff programs from Get Buff 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all based on 4. Now that is going to change in some of the later volumes. We will go back to some 3-day-a-week programs, which I think is appropriate for the age group or the stage of life that the next 2 Get Buff books will relate to, or the latter 2 Get Buff books will relate to. But at the program design, you can see that program design. The people who are writing normal bodybuilding programs at the time, which were muscle-based programs, like this is my shoulder and tricep day, this is my back and bicep day. Well, I didn't do that. I did lines of movement. But you can see those people suddenly switch in their program design for at least a period of time because the 4-day model that I developed using lines of movement became so popular, temporarily at least. There were some things that weren't popular and still haven't become popular. And one of them was the control. The technical model I taught about controlling the pelvis position during the squat and the deadlift still has not been accepted by mainstream. In fact, one of the world's greatest plagiarizers out of California would literally word verbatim the description of those 2 exercises, squat and the deadlift, and delete the part about hip control because he was a popularist and he didn't want to publish anything that resulted in anything less than being popular. So they'd say anything to be popular, and they weren't going to publish unpopular concepts because the concept of controlling your pelvis, it was perceived at the time and still is as being counter to what the bodybuilders do, which is push out. Well, it's not counter what the bodybuilders do. It's a stage of development. But you can learn more about that in Get Buff 5, which will be out shortly, and also the Legacy series, where I spent a lot of time explaining my pelvic control model, which was published extensively by myself from the 90s onwards. So they're just some of the things. So I'm sure I've missed a lot, but some of the things that we cover in that book.
Rest periods. I mean, everything was more detailed and new in that regard too. So
Yeah,
yeah.
manipulating the rest periods. So I basically taught people how to manipulate every single variable. In fact, if you look at the variables identified in the How to Write book in 98, it really gives you a good snapshot of all variables that are available to be manipulated. And the aim of the Get Buff 1 book was to give a layman's version of the How to Write book. Because the How to Write book, whilst not considered a scientific publication, it was a little bit more theoretical in nature, where the Get Buff book was aimed at being something that was written for the way that the end user could use without having to be a rocket scientist, without being scared off by science, which I don't do. I don't believe that people should be intimidated by science in terms of. I know it's a strategy, it's a marketing strategy. People say, look at all the big words I'm using. Well, that's not my style. I want to speak in every man's language, but using concepts. And at the end of the day, I'm going to line up all the theories that I've released, and in the Legacy Volume 3, the total was 423 of them. I'm sure there were a few more, but of those 423, I'm looking forward to one day to sitting down and looking at what science has confirmed. I'll give you an example. I put a theory out in around the turn of the century where I said that the more advanced you got as a strength training athlete, the lower the average rep that you will be optimal for you. So in the beginning, you might find it's optimal to do 15, then it'll drop to 12, then it'll drop to 10, and drop to 8, drop to 6s. So, by the time you've been training seriously for enough time, it'll be lower than it used to be. I got a feeling that's been validated in science along with, anything. But there is one that hasn't. That's the concept of time under tension. So that's a term I coined. And it's been bounced around a lot. In fact, I see that so extensively in scientific articles, but I don't know whether they've actually validated it or they're just using it because it sounds cool. But the concept of time under tension would something also that you would have been exposed to in Get Buff 1 for the first time, or at least the How to Write book before that. So yeah, some great insights into Get Buff 1. I've got another thing I want to share about who should be using it, but before I do, I just wanted to pause for a second. Anyone else had anything they wanted to add? If I triggered another thought.
There's one more actually. The 2 sets by 8 reps or 10 reps instead of doing 3 or 4 sets by that was unique for me too.
Absolutely. So I was the first person that I know that said, listen, Delorme, God bless his work. He was a surgeon, a medical doctor out of America, working with I think World War II veterans who've been injured, and you always learn a lot when you're rehabbing soldiers because you get so many. Unfortunately, and with all due respect to my brothers and sisters in arms, you get so many broken bodies. So Delorme came up with the 2 sets of 10, 3 sets of 10 kind of concept, and that stayed like almost Bible-like. It was almost like, how dare you? And I basically said, well, that's really sweet. There is a time and place for it, but it can be pretty ineffective. And I said, I don't do a lot of times where I'll do more than 2 sets, say, at the same rep. But if I do, it'll be a wave loading method, not like the same load, or you might do step loading. But yes, Dave, that's a very good point. I was the first person to say, listen, Dr. Delorme, I respect your work, but let's take it a step further. And that whole discussion about loading protocols, reps and sets, and I put a lot of work into that. And I think there was an article I wrote called the Wave Loading Manifesto, where I think was a pretty good summary of that, or any of my books. But that's a good point, Dave. Where I was the first person to say Delorme's work, we can do it a little bit better in some cases. Not all the time. It's still applicable. I don't want to be a smarty pants, but yes, Dave, that's a really good point because I absolutely had never heard anybody say that before that. And I know how many programs I've done, which is X number of sets of this and X number of sets of that. Now, fortunately, I had a fair bit of time in the weightlifting, Olympic lifting, and powerlifting background. So I got involved in more, a little bit more Eastern European sort of communist state-sponsored programs in terms of the loading parameters. But I still did my fair share of, the Delorme influence 3 or 4 sets of whatever. Good point, David. I appreciate that.
it's a programming we can return to every year and get value from it.
And that's my big point, because I'm going to tell you this. People come to me and they're saying, "Oh, you got get buff 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'll go get buff 5 in." They don't always ask. They might say, "I'm just going to get buff 3 because I'm not a beginner. I can't start with get buff 1 because I'm not a beginner." And I don't have a lot of hair left, so I can't pull it out. But it's pretty frustrating to see anybody tell me that they don't need get buff 1. And so I got to a point where I was trying to restrict sales and get buff 4 and make sure, listen, get the first 3 before you even look at get buff 4, because there's a few people on the planet. There's so few people on the planet that need get buff 4. I'm not saying in absolute numbers, but in percentage terms, as a relative terms, it's relatively small population. So I just can't stress enough what Don's just said there. I personally return to get buff 1 once a year, minimum, if not sometimes twice a year. I typically start my annual cycle with a Get Buff 1 program. That is how good it is. And I created that program way back in the early 90s, published it in the late 90s, and I'm still doing it 30, 40 years later. So I'm either brain dead or it's a really good program. And you don't have to do the same thing identically each time, but the concepts are there. If you look at the way I developed the 4 stages of Get Buff 1, and I explain the rationale. That's one of the beautiful things that I find about the Get Buff series, is that I explain the phases. This is why I designed the phase, and this is why I designed the next phase, and this is how the next phase works in, etc., etc. So whether it's identical or whether it's a modification of, the concepts laid out in Get Buff 1 are for everybody every year. Now, you can go on and be more advanced and esoteric, sure, but don't tell me Get Buff 1's not for you. So I appreciate you raising that point, Don. And before I do want to take an extension of that point, but I'll just pause for a second if anyone else wanted to add, or we move on. So the other comment I want to make is they're generic programs. Get Buff are generic programs. And I'm not a huge fan of generic program, but if it's better than what someone's doing, then I have no problems with it. But generally speaking, I spent my entire career individualizing programs for athletes. Like I've never been in person with an athlete and given everybody the same program. It just doesn't happen. I have used generic in some international programs where I haven't had direct contact with the athlete, and it's a low budget program. It's very rare. I have done it. It's very rare. It actually hurts to write a generic program because you might have 1,000 people and it might suit one completely. Now, that doesn't mean that the programs are useless, but what I'm saying is that feel free to individualize a program based on the information that's in the book. Don't feel obliged to always just do the same program. Make the individual changes. For example, you might have a joint that's a bit unhappy and needs to have some exercises changes. You might have equipment differences and need to make changes, which I'll bring back to the equipment in a second. That's a good reminder. So I just wanted to stress that I'm proud of anybody who's willing to individualize their program based upon the model I present. The aim of the Get Buff program was to give an example in the place where it was a better example than what most people were doing. But I'm going to touch on equipment for a moment, if no one else had a point there. So when I wrote the Get Buff program, there were equipment in gyms that just generally speaking don't exist anymore. And when I say don't exist anymore, they do exist in old bodybuilding gyms or rehab clinics, but they don't exist in most low budget, small box, to use a hip word, training facilities for 2 reasons. One, if you've got an exercise device that only does one exercise, like a seated leg extension or a seated lying leg curl, that's it, does that. The station will cost between $3,000 and $10,000 on average. So after the economic collapse of the mid-cycle slump in 2001, after the dot-com bubble bust, 9/11, etc., there was an economic downturn for a few years. And that was the moment when the appetite for building big equipment, storing big equipment, selling big equipment, and buying big equipment changed. And that allowed the opportunity for the functional training marketers to come in and say, well, I'm going to import this stuff from China. I'm going to buy it for $2, sell it for $20. It's a great little business model. I've just got to get some fool to travel around the country and do a functional training seminar for me to popularize it. Now, to support that, it went a step further. It just wasn't, hey, it just wasn't the functional training people saying this is a superior method. There was also a commercial espionage going on where there was an intended attack, in my opinion, to discredit the big equipment. And I'll give an example. I've had one fool write a paragraph that I'm assuming it was intended towards me. He didn't have the balls to use my name, but it was a virtual signaling. So his programs were so bad that he had leg extensions and leg curls in them. So it became, we went through an era from 2001 to 2010 in particular, where if you wanted to be a virtual signaler, you could say, I'm better because I'm smarter and I'm more up with the trends and the science, and it's bad to use leg extensions and leg curls. Well, a lot of fucking bullshit. Machines aren't always the best. No question about it. I've never said machines are the best. You know, body weight's number one, barbells number two, or dumbbells, and the machines are. But there is definitely a time and a place for a machine, and more so in the bodybuilding realm than in the athlete preparation world. But to tell me that an exercise is bad and should be done is absolute bullshit. Now, there are exercises that do place some load on your joint. Now, let's take leg extension, for example. The leg extension does place load on the patellofemoral joint. Well, guess what? Squatting places pressure on the meniscus. So there's no such thing in exercise that doesn't have a risk. You can't tell me that a piece of steel sitting in the corner with a bit of vinyl and padding is evil. Like such a load of bullshit. It was negativity that was generated to support the functional training sales and the philosophies. Well, obviously that's come and gone, and they'll come back in. But you know, there's been some really nice leg extension leg curl leg extension machines developed over time using different forms of resistance. Nautilus had a beautiful machine using their cam-shaped design. There was a few hydraulics, you know, with pistons. It's almost sad to see majority of the people in the world not get access to that piece of equipment. But I do get it from a commercial point of view. So if you wanted to set up a gym with a equipment that could do one joint or one exercise, you need, you know, 30, 40 stations. It takes a lot of space and it takes a big budget. And most people are running their fitness centers on a small budget and a small space. So if that's the reason you're not using those machines, great. But don't tell me you don't have them in there because they're bad or they're bad for the body, because most of the shit that people are doing is the way they're doing is bad for their body. You don't need a machine to be bad to your body. You know, just get a few little weird shaped things and throw them around and jump up and down. And you know, I won't even get specific about some of the things that have changed the world for the worse. Okay, so I'll get off my high horse and my soapbox for a second. Anyone else got a comment on some of the things we've talked about in the Get Buff One book that changed the way the world trained, literally? Okay, well, appreciate your input, and we're going to wrap it at that. It was a great walk down memory lane. That book hasn't gone away, and we're still using it. We're still applying it. I teach generalized principles. I don't teach trends. What I teach is not something that in 2 years' time a new trend will come along and supersede it. There'll be attempts to do so. From a trend perspective, it may be, but from a genuine application perspective, it's not the case. What I teach does not go away, other than the trends might move away, but a trend is simply another way to sell an equipment device, create a training method to support the sale of the device. I go a bit deeper in that in my books, including Get Bar 5, which is the first chapter, in fact. But I'll let you find that for yourself. Appreciate everybody's input. Thank you.